Welcome back to the English Pod community. Today's episode is all about learning how to think in English and stop translating from your native language. If you've been learning English for a while, you might still find yourself mentally translating when you speak. It's a common challenge, but the good news is that it's something you can improve with practice. In this episode, I'm going to share some strategies that will help you train your brain to use English directly without relying on translation. Let's dive in. When I was first learning English, I would often get stuck trying to translate words from my native language into English. I realized that this slowed me down, especially when I wanted to speak quickly. So I started using a strategy that really helped me. I began to focus more on the meaning behind the words rather than the exact translation. For instance, if I wanted to express that I was excited about something, I didn't focus on translating each word from my first language. Instead, I tried to think about the feeling of excitement in English. I would say, "I can't wait for this," or "This is going to be amazing." The more I practiced this way of thinking, the more natural it felt. Another helpful tip is to start thinking about your daily life in English. For example, when you wake up in the morning, try to describe what you're doing in English. "I'm making my coffee now," or "I'm getting ready for the day." At first, it might feel strange, but over time, it becomes easier to think in English, and the translation process starts to fade away. One of the biggest challenges I faced when trying to stop translating in my head was understanding how to think in English for everyday situations. Let me tell you a little story about it. I remember one morning I was running late for work. I was rushing around the house getting dressed, and mentally, I kept translating everything. I was thinking, I need to put on my jacket, but I kept thinking the phrase in my native language first, and then trying to convert it into English. It was so frustrating because I was losing time and getting nervous about being late. Then, something clicked. I realized that the more I translated in my head, the slower my brain worked. So, I decided to try something different. I took a deep breath and said to myself, "Okay, stop thinking in your language. Just think in English." I started focusing on the task itself. "I'm putting on my jacket," I thought. It wasn't perfect at first, and I stumbled over a few words. But after a while, I felt much more confident. What helped was practicing this in simple moments of daily life, like when I was brushing my teeth or making breakfast. "I'm brushing my teeth," or "I'm frying the eggs." It was a small change, but it made a big difference in how I started thinking and speaking in English. Another way to practice thinking in English is by listening to the language constantly. Now, I don't mean just passively listening to English. I mean really engaging with it. For example, when I would listen to podcasts or watch shows, I would try to mimic the conversations. If someone in the show said, "I can't believe how cold it is outside," I would repeat it aloud, even if I wasn't in a conversation. It's like training your mind to absorb English expressions, just like how we learn our first language. And you know what's funny? The more I started mimicking, the more it felt like I wasn't translating anymore. It was as though I had switched gears in my brain. The words just started coming out in English, without me thinking about how to say them. It's like when you're so immersed in a language, it becomes second nature. For instance, I remember having a conversation with my friend Claire, who is a native English speaker. We were talking about our weekend plans, and for the first time, I didn't find myself mentally translating. It felt so natural to say, "I'm planning to go hiking with some friends. We're going to this beautiful trail near the lake." It felt effortless, like I wasn't holding back anymore. One more thing I did that helped a lot was using images to connect with English. When I was learning new vocabulary, instead of translating the word directly, I would associate the word with a picture or an experience. So, when I learned the word sunshine, I didn't think of how to say sunshine in my first language. Instead, I thought about the feeling of the sun on my skin and the warmth it brought. I imagined the bright, sunny days I spent at the beach with my family. This technique helped me to remember words more easily because I wasn't just memorizing them. I was attaching them to real-life emotions and experiences. This approach is especially useful when you're faced with a difficult situation, like when you're talking to a new person in English. Let's say you meet someone at a party and you want to ask them about their job. Instead of thinking, how do I say this in English? Try to think about the context. For example, imagine you're talking to a guy named Daniel at a party. You want to ask him about his job. Instead of translating word by word, try to think in English. So, Daniel, what do you do for work? Don't worry about translating. Just focus on the meaning of the question and the flow of the conversation. The more you practice this, the easier it will become to use English naturally in conversations. And here's another tip. If you make a mistake, don't panic. It's part of the process. When I was still learning, I made plenty of mistakes. But over time, I realized that making mistakes in English isn't the end of the world. It's just a step toward getting better. For example, I remember once telling someone, I'm cooking lunch right now, when I meant to say, I'm preparing lunch right now. I laughed at myself, but the important thing is that I didn't get stuck in translating. I just kept going, and it didn't affect the conversation. Lastly, think about the expressions you use daily. For example, when you talk about how you feel, instead of translating the feeling from your native language into English, try saying things like, I'm feeling really excited about this, or I'm a bit nervous about the presentation tomorrow. These simple phrases are not only useful, but help you express yourself in a way that feels natural without overthinking or translating. By making these expressions part of your routine, you'll start using them automatically, without even realizing it. So, as I was saying earlier, thinking in English is all about making English a part of your daily life. It's not just about learning new words, it's about learning how to use those words naturally in real situations. Here's something I tried that really helped me. One morning, I had a meeting at work. I was feeling nervous because I had to present a new project to my team. In the past, I would have spent the entire day thinking in my native language about how to explain things. But this time, I decided to focus on just thinking in English. I started by thinking about what I wanted to say in simple English sentences. I didn't try to translate every word. Instead, I thought about the message I wanted to get across. I remember thinking to myself, I need to explain this project clearly. I want them to understand my ideas. And then I started practicing. The phrases I might say out loud, like, let me walk you through this project, or I believe this is a great opportunity for our team. Even if I didn't have all the perfect words at that moment, I tried to think in a way that felt comfortable. Then, during the meeting, I was able to speak with more confidence. I didn't feel as if I was translating everything from my native language anymore. My mind was focused on expressing my ideas, not on finding the right words. I felt much more connected to the conversation, and my team could sense that I was more relaxed. This is an important point. When you stop translating and start thinking in English, it also changes how you feel during conversations. It helps you sound more confident because you're not trying to process each sentence in your head. You're just expressing yourself naturally. For example, when I was talking to my colleague Maria last week, we were discussing an upcoming event at work. I could have easily translated everything from my language to English, but instead I focused on describing the event in English directly. I said, the event is going to be really fun. We're going to have guest speakers and activities. And Maria responded with, that sounds great. I'm excited to hear the speakers. It was such a simple exchange, but the difference was that I wasn't translating in my head. I was just thinking and speaking in English, and this made the conversation flow easily. Another key aspect of thinking in English is practicing with others. This could be with friends, colleagues, or even online language partners. I remember when I first started practicing speaking English regularly, I felt nervous, especially when talking to native speakers. I would often second-guess myself and think about how to translate something from my native language, but I pushed myself to stop doing that. I realized that if I waited until I could perfectly translate every thought, I'd never speak. So I started talking to my friend Liam, who's from the UK, more often. We would talk about random things like movies, books, or weekend plans. One day I was telling him about a trip I had taken last summer, Normally, I would have thought, how do I say this in English? But that day, I just focused on telling the story. I said, last summer, I went to a beautiful beach. The water was so clear, and the sand felt warm under my feet. Liam smiled and said, that sounds amazing. Where exactly did you go? Without even realizing it, I wasn't translating in my head anymore. I was just thinking in English and sharing my experience, and it felt so natural. You might be wondering how to start practicing these skills on your own. Well, one great way is to keep a journal in English. Instead of writing in your native language and translating later, try to write your thoughts directly in English. Don't worry about grammar mistakes or perfect sentences. Just focus on getting the meaning across. For example, in the morning, you might write, today I feel excited because I'm going to meet my friend Sarah later. This simple act of writing in English without translating helps you connect your thoughts with English in a more direct way. It also helps you become more familiar with English sentence structures and expressions. After a few weeks of journaling, you'll begin to notice that you're thinking less about the translation and more about how to express your ideas in English. And guess what? This will carry over to your speaking as well. As you practice, you'll find that expressing yourself in English becomes easier and faster. Here's another interesting idea. If you're not ready to speak with someone just yet, try thinking in English while doing activities like shopping or walking around town. Let's say you're in a grocery store. Instead of thinking, I need to buy milk, eggs, and bread, think in English. I need to buy some milk, eggs, and bread. You don't need to speak out loud, but simply making these mental shifts will help you start thinking in English more automatically. I've also found it helpful to learn English expressions in context, not just as individual words. For instance, instead of memorizing words like happy or tired, try learning them in common expressions. For example, instead of thinking of just the word tired, learn to say, I'm feeling exhausted today, or I've had a long day at work. These phrases will come in handy when you're speaking and will help you think in English more naturally. By now, you might start realizing that thinking in English isn't something that happens overnight. It takes time and practice. But every step you take in this direction gets you closer to thinking in English without translating. The more you expose yourself to English in real-life situations, the more automatic it becomes. And the best part is that you'll start to feel more confident when speaking because your brain will have trained itself to communicate directly in English. You know, one of the things I've realized as I've been practicing thinking in English is that the process really never stops. It's something you keep improving over time, and it's not always as easy as you might think. For example, I was having a conversation with my friend Ella just the other day. She's a native English speaker, and we were talking about how we both love hiking. Now, normally, when I'm having a conversation like that, I can think in English without translating, but there was one point in the conversation where I started to trip up. Ella mentioned a mountain trail she had recently explored, and I started to think about how to say, that sounds like a great idea in English. For a moment, I found myself translating that phrase from my native language. I caught myself, though. I remembered something important. It's not about trying to say things perfectly. It's about conveying your thoughts in the best way possible. So, I took a deep breath and said, that sounds like an awesome plan. I'd love to try it. Ella smiled and said, you're more than welcome to join me next time. In that moment, I realized that the key wasn't in finding the perfect translation. It was in just getting the words out and communicating. Even though I had stumbled for a second, I was still able to participate in the conversation, and that was what mattered most. So, here's a good tip I can give you from that experience. When you're speaking in English, focus less on perfect grammar or word-for-word translation. Instead, try to express the idea you want to communicate. For example, let's say you want to tell someone that you enjoyed a movie, but you're not sure about the exact words. You could say, the movie was really good. Or you could say, I really liked it. It was fun and exciting. The point is that you're expressing your opinion in a natural way, and the more you practice, the more these kinds of sentences will start coming to you automatically. A key part of this is also making sure you're listening to English constantly. This doesn't mean just listening to podcasts or TV shows, although that definitely helps. It also means listening to people around you when they speak. Just last weekend, I had lunch with my friend Ben. We were talking about our upcoming holiday plans, and instead of just thinking, I need to say I'm going to visit my family, I tried to think in English directly. I told him, I'm going to visit my family this weekend. I haven't seen them in a while, so I'm really looking forward to it. Ben replied, That sounds great. I'm sure they'll be happy to see you. In that simple exchange, I wasn't translating each word in my head. I was just thinking and speaking in English. But it wasn't always this easy for me. I had to practice, and at first, it felt really awkward. I would often think too much about how to say something. But with time, I started to trust that the more I practiced, the more natural it would become. Listening to people speak in English helps you hear how native speakers use language in context. This will also improve your ability to think in English. For example, if you hear someone say, I can't wait to meet you, you can start thinking about how you can use that same phrase in your conversations. The more you expose yourself to English, the easier it becomes to use it in your daily life. Another way to practice thinking in English is by switching your environment to English. This doesn't mean you need to live in an English-speaking country, but it's about changing the language around you as much as possible. For example, when I'm at home, I try to use English for everything. I set my phone and computer to English, and I watch TV shows in English. If I'm cooking, I'll think in English about what I'm doing. I'll say things like, I'm cutting the vegetables, or I'm boiling the water for pasta. It might feel a bit silly at first, but the more you do it, the more natural it will become. A funny thing happened to me the other day when I was cooking dinner. I was preparing a soup, and as I was chopping vegetables, I said out loud in English, I'm adding carrots and onions to the pot. But my dog, Max, was sitting nearby, and it was as if he understood me. He started wagging his tail, and I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the feeling of being able to speak in English and express myself clearly without worrying about translating each word. Max didn't care about grammar, but I felt more confident because I was able to communicate with ease. This is something I want to emphasize. When you stop translating, you'll also start enjoying speaking in English more. I've noticed that once I stopped translating everything, my conversations became less stressful. Take, for example, when I went to a cafe with my friend Julia last week. We were chatting about our favorite books, and instead of thinking about the exact translation of words, I just talked about the books I loved. I said, I really enjoyed reading The Great Gatsby. It's one of my favorite books because of the way it explores the theme of the American dream. Julia responded, I love that book too. The way Gatsby tries to achieve his dreams is so interesting. We didn't focus on perfect grammar, but we both understood each other clearly, and the conversation felt natural. That's when I realized something important. You don't need to translate every sentence in your head. You just need to practice thinking in English, and eventually it will start to feel like second nature. This is the point you want to reach, where English feels as natural as your native language. You know, I think one of the most powerful tools in thinking directly in English is to be comfortable with making mistakes. I remember when I first started focusing on thinking in English, I was so afraid of making errors that I ended up overthinking everything. It's a feeling I think a lot of learners can relate to. I would hesitate before speaking, thinking, is this the right word? Is this the correct grammar? The problem with that approach was that it slowed me down. I wasn't speaking with confidence, and as a result, I wasn't making as much progress. But over time, I started to embrace mistakes. A perfect example of this was during a recent conversation I had with my colleague Sarah at work. We were discussing an upcoming project, and I needed to explain that I hadn't yet received some important information. In my head, I thought about how to say it perfectly, but I realized that I could simply get the point across and not worry about every detail. I said, I still don't have the info I need. Can you send it to me? Sarah didn't care about my exact choice of words. She understood me, and we moved on with the discussion. This is such a key moment when it comes to thinking in English. It's about being clear, not perfect. And the more you allow yourself to speak without overthinking, the easier it becomes to think in English without translating. This shift from worrying about accuracy to focusing on communication is a game changer. Another thing I've learned through practicing this is that it's really helpful to expose yourself to everyday conversations in English. For example, I've been reading a lot more in English, not just books, but also news articles, blogs, and even Instagram posts. These are small interactions, but they help me build a natural vocabulary that fits into real-life conversations. Just last week, I was talking to my friend Lily, who's a native English speaker, and we were discussing a movie we both recently watched. Instead of translating each word in my head, I just started thinking about what I wanted to say. I said, I really liked the film. It had such a great storyline. The main character went through so many ups and downs, and I couldn't stop watching. Lily smiled and replied, Yeah, I couldn't take my eyes off the screen either. The ending really surprised me. This conversation was easy for me to follow because we were using natural, everyday phrases. The more you practice using phrases like these in real conversations, the easier it gets to stop translating and just think in English. Let's take a look at another scenario to illustrate this. A few months ago, I went on a weekend trip with some friends, and we stayed in a small cabin in the mountains. I was having a conversation with Jane, one of my friends who speaks very good English. We were planning a hike for the next day, and I remember thinking, I need to ask if we should bring water and snacks. Normally, I would have paused, translated the words in my mind, and then tried to form the question. But this time, I just thought about what I needed to know and said, Do you think we should bring snacks and water for the hike tomorrow? Jane looked at me and said, Definitely. It's a long trail, so we'll need to stay hydrated. This moment was so important because I wasn't thinking in my native language first. I was thinking directly in English. I didn't pause to find the exact translation for snacks or hydrated in my mind. I just went for it, and it felt so natural. But here's something I want you to remember. It's okay to make small mistakes while doing this. What matters is that you're practicing and getting better. The idea of not translating each word in your head can be intimidating at first. I totally get it. I remember feeling like I was getting it wrong sometimes. But the truth is, the more you practice, the less you'll rely on translations. And over time, it will become more automatic. It might feel challenging at first, but trust me, it's worth the effort. A perfect example of this happened to me while I was talking to Mike at a cafe last week. We were discussing our favorite hobbies, and I was trying to explain that I wanted to learn how to play guitar. Normally, I would have thought about the translation for guitar in my native language before saying it in English. But this time, I just said, I've always wanted to learn guitar. I think it would be so fun to play. Mike smiled and said, That's awesome. I actually know a little bit. I could teach you some basics if you want. Looking back at that conversation, I realized how much I had improved. I didn't pause to translate the words. I was just thinking in English and expressing myself naturally. This is the power of immersing yourself in English and letting go of the need for translation. The more you practice thinking in English, the more you'll notice that it becomes second nature, just like how you think in your native language. Another great way to improve your ability to think in English is by writing in English regularly. Writing might seem like a small thing, but it actually plays a big role in helping you practice thinking in English. Whether you're writing a diary entry, a short story, or even a message to a friend, the act of writing in English forces you to form sentences without translating from your native language. It helps you develop a direct connection to the language. Started writing in English every morning for about 10 minutes, just jotting down my thoughts, and I noticed huge improvements. For example, one day I wrote, I'm feeling really excited about the weekend. I'm going to visit my cousin, and we're going to see a movie together. It's been a while since we hung out, so I can't wait to catch up. This simple practice helped me stop thinking in my native language and start forming ideas directly in English. The more you write like this, the more fluent you'll become in thinking in English. It's a powerful tool that really helps in the long run. Finally, one thing I encourage you to do is surround yourself with English as much as possible. The more you hear it, the more your brain starts to adjust. For instance, if you're watching a show in your native language, try switching the language settings to English. If you're reading a book, switch to an English version, even if it's challenging at first. The more exposure you get, the faster you'll start thinking in English. A while ago, I decided to watch an entire series in English, even though it was a little difficult at first. It was a mystery show, and I was intrigued by the storyline, so I didn't want to wait for subtitles in my native language. The first few episodes were tough, and I had to rewind a lot to understand everything. But by the end of the season, I noticed I could follow most of the dialogue without any problems. I realized that the more I pushed myself out of my comfort zone, the easier it became to think in English without relying on translations. So, let's talk a little more about how your environment plays a huge role in training your mind to think directly in English. One thing I've noticed is that the more you surround yourself with English, the less you need to translate. Think about it like this. If you were to visit a new country where everyone speaks a different language, at first, you'd probably rely on translations a lot. You'd search for your native words in your mind before speaking. But after some time, you'd start picking up the language naturally. You wouldn't need to translate every time you wanted to order food or ask for directions. The same thing happens when you expose yourself to English every day. A great example of this happened to me when I traveled to an English-speaking country for the first time. I remember feeling a little overwhelmed when I first arrived. I had been practicing my English, but hearing it spoken so quickly around me was different. At first, I found myself mentally translating everything into my native language. I would hear a phrase like, "Where are you from?" and I would pause for a second to mentally translate it. But after just a few days, something shifted. As I interacted with the locals, my brain started to automatically understand what they were saying without any need for translation. I remember one specific instance when I was at a cafe and I wanted to ask for a glass of water. Normally, I would have translated the words glass of water into my native language before speaking, but this time I just said, "Can I have a glass of water, please?" And the waiter understood immediately. It felt so natural, and it was one of those moments when I realized that thinking directly in English was becoming easier. This change doesn't happen overnight, though. It takes time and effort. But the key is immersion. The more you put yourself in situations where English is the only language around you, the faster your brain will start thinking in English. For example, after that trip, I started listening to English podcasts on my way to work, watching movies in English, and even changing the language settings on my phone and social media accounts. It wasn't about understanding every single word, but more about getting used to the rhythm, the flow, and the natural expressions that come with it. Little by little, I stopped thinking in my native language and just responded in English, and that made my speaking much more fluent. Now, let's discuss another crucial aspect: practicing thinking in English during your daily activities. It's easy to forget that every day offers an opportunity to practice. Whether you're making breakfast, running errands, or doing household chores, you can practice English by simply narrating your actions in your mind. I'll give you a perfect example of how I did this last weekend. I was cooking dinner and I decided to try thinking in English the whole time. As I chopped the vegetables, I mentally said to myself, "I'm chopping the carrots. Now I'll slice the onions. Next, I'll heat the oil in the pan." At first, it felt a little strange, but the more I did it, the more natural it became. By the end of cooking, I was able to think through the whole process in English without even realizing it. This technique is incredibly effective because it helps you get used to thinking in real-world situations. When you start narrating your day in English, you're training your brain to automatically use the language. Instead of translating chopping or onions into your native language, your mind starts to make those connections directly in English. You can do this with anything, from getting dressed to planning your day. The more you integrate English into your routine, the more natural it will feel. Another thing I recommend is to practice by asking yourself questions in English throughout the day. For instance, when I'm out for a walk, I might think to myself, "What do I want to do today?" Or, "Where should I go for lunch?" These are simple thoughts, but they're powerful because they encourage you to think without translating first. In a way, you're starting to have conversations with yourself in English. And even though it may seem like a small thing, this kind of self-talk is very effective in helping your brain switch to thinking in English. And it doesn't stop there. This method works great when you're doing tasks like shopping too. I remember when I went grocery shopping last week, and I tried thinking in English while looking at different products. Instead of asking myself, what should I buy today? In my native language, I asked myself, what do I need to buy for dinner? In English. Then, when I picked up some ingredients, I would say to myself, I need to get some tomatoes and I'll grab some rice. It felt a little awkward at first, but the more I practiced, the easier it became. It helped me build connections between the objects around me and their English names. And soon enough, I was able to think directly in English during my daily activities without even thinking about it. Another situation I find really useful for practicing thinking in English is when you're making decisions. Whether it's planning your weekend or deciding what to eat, you can do it all in English. Just the other day, I was planning to meet my friend Sarah for lunch. Normally, I'd have thought, should we go to that Italian restaurant? But this time, I thought in English. Do I want pizza today, or should I try something new? These decisions don't need to be complicated, but by practicing them in English, you're helping your mind get used to the language in a natural, everyday context. It's funny because I remember when I first started trying this, it felt so strange. I kept catching myself switching back to my native language, but that's completely normal. Don't be discouraged if it feels unnatural at first. The key is consistency. The more you do this, the more natural it will feel. And honestly, it's a bit like exercising a muscle. You need to work at it regularly to build up your strength. Another thing that's been really helpful for me in terms of thinking in English is surrounding myself with English-speaking people. Of course, not everyone around me speaks English, but whenever I get the chance, I try to engage with English speakers as much as possible. For example, a few months ago, I met a new colleague at work named Emily. Emily is from Canada, and she speaks English fluently. I remember feeling a little nervous when we started talking because I didn't want to make mistakes. But she was so kind and patient. I would ask her questions like, what do you do in your free time? And instead of translating my questions, I'd just think in English and ask directly. And as we had more conversations, I realized that I was thinking in English without even trying to translate. These conversations helped me tremendously because they pushed me out of my comfort zone. I started to respond more quickly, and it became easier to express my ideas without translating them first. Emily would sometimes correct me gently, but it wasn't embarrassing. If anything, it was encouraging because it helped me grow. So, I highly recommend finding language partners or joining language exchange groups if possible. The more you speak in English, the more you'll train your brain to think in the language. I also started doing something else that helped me a lot. I watched English language YouTube channels and podcasts. I found that listening to people speaking English in everyday situations gave me more natural expressions to use in conversations. The more I listened, the more I picked up on expressions like, you know what I mean? Or, that's a great idea. These phrases are part of casual, conversational English, and by hearing them often, I started using them in my own conversations. It's another way to build confidence and get comfortable with thinking in English. At this point, I want to talk about something I've noticed in myself and with many of my students. One of the hardest things about learning a new language, especially at higher levels like C1 and C2, is that your brain often wants to take shortcuts. It tries to translate directly from your native language into English, which slows down your speech and makes it sound less natural. But here's the trick. Once you stop translating and allow yourself to think in English, you'll notice a huge improvement in your fluency. I remember one of my students, Clara, who was always frustrated by how long it took her to respond when speaking English. She would understand everything just fine, but when she had to speak, she'd pause a lot, trying to figure out how to translate her thoughts from Spanish into English. It was tiring for her, and I completely understood because I had been in the same situation. One day, after a lesson, Clara told me she was going to try something different. Instead of translating, she was going to think about her day in English. She started small, just describing simple things she did in her routine, like, I woke up at 7 a.m., made breakfast, and went to the park. It seemed easy, but Clara didn't realize that this small shift was going to make a big difference. After a week, she came back to class and told me that she felt more confident. She could speak without having to stop and translate all the time. She mentioned that one day when she was talking to a friend in English, she realized that she hadn't been translating any of her sentences in her head. Instead, the words just came out naturally. That was a breakthrough for Clara. She started thinking directly in English without first filtering everything through her native language. She wasn't translating "I woke up" or "went to the park" anymore. She just knew how to say it in English automatically. Now, let's talk about something that might sound surprising, but is really effective: changing your inner dialogue to English. We all have that inner voice that talks to us throughout the day. This voice is responsible for helping us make decisions, reminding us of things we need to do, and giving us that inner commentary about our experiences. If you want to stop translating in your head, try changing that inner voice to English. Start simple by narrating your day, like Clara did, but make a habit of doing it every day. For example, I'll share a funny story. A while back, I was working on a project at home. I had to organize some files, clean up, and take care of a few tasks. As I was working, I started mentally telling myself in English, "Okay, let's clean up first, then I'll organize the files." At first, it felt strange because I wasn't used to thinking in English for simple tasks. But by doing it regularly, my brain got used to processing everything in English. Even when I wasn't trying to speak or think in English, my mind started to just speak to me in English. It was like my brain was rewiring itself to naturally use English instead of my native language. This idea of inner English is a powerful technique that I encourage you to try. When you're walking around, cooking, or just doing anything, that doesn't require too much thinking. Try thinking in English. Tell yourself things like, "This coffee tastes great," or "I need to pick up some groceries later." You don't need to worry about grammar at first. Just speak to yourself in English. Over time, your brain will begin to think in English without you realizing it. It'll be like learning to ride a bike. At first, it's awkward and slow, but eventually it becomes second nature. I want to share a small story about my friend Mia, who is an advanced English learner. She had been living in an English-speaking country for a couple of years, but still found herself translating a lot. One day, she came to me with a solution. She told me that for the next few weeks, she would practice speaking only English in her mind. She wouldn't even speak in her native language to herself. If she had to talk to her family or friends in her native language, she would simply say, "I'm practicing English today, so I can't speak in native language." She said it was hard at first, and it took her a while to get used to, but after a few days, she felt like English was starting to become her default language. At first, Mia was skeptical because she felt like she was losing a bit of her own voice. But after about a week, she realized she was thinking about everything in English. Even when she was planning her day, she started to imagine the words in English instead of in her native language. For example, she would think, "I need to go to the store and buy eggs," instead of thinking in her native language first and then translating. This technique helped Mia a lot, and I highly recommend giving it a try, especially if you're at a more advanced level like C1 or C2. Another way to get your brain to stop translating is by actively using English when you're thinking about abstract ideas. This may seem a bit harder, but it's an excellent way to push yourself into using English for more complex thinking. For instance, when I'm reflecting on my day or making decisions, I don't translate. I just think in English. Instead of saying, "I should call my mom to check in my native language," and then translating it into English, I just think, "I should call my mom to check in." Even when I'm planning something complicated or thinking about abstract concepts like the future or personal goals, I try to do it in English. Here's a short example from my own experience. One day, I was thinking about a project I was working on and was feeling a bit stuck. Normally, I would have thought, maybe I should change my plan, or it's not going to work out in my native language. But this time, I tried something different. I forced myself to think in English and say to myself, "I need to find a better solution for this project." And then I asked myself, What can I do to improve this situation? I was surprised at how quickly I found a solution when I thought directly in English. Thinking in English helped me approach the situation from a different perspective. This method of thinking in English, especially for abstract or complex thoughts, really helps your brain adjust to English in the same way you process ideas in your native language. It's about breaking away from that mental translation process. Your brain starts to create those connections in English, and soon you'll realize that you don't need to translate anymore at all. And here's the thing. Thinking in English doesn't mean you have to be perfect. It's okay to make mistakes. Even native speakers make mistakes while thinking in their own language. The most important thing is that you're practicing. And over time, you'll find that thinking in English becomes easier and more natural. So, as we wrap up today's episode, remember that the key to thinking in English and stopping the habit of translating is consistent practice. Start small, think in English throughout your day, and gradually challenge yourself to use English. For more complex thoughts and conversations, it's all about creating new mental connections. And with time, you'll find that thinking in English becomes as natural as thinking in your native language. Don't worry if it feels difficult at first. It's a process. The more you practice, the more fluent you'll become. Keep pushing yourself, and soon enough, you'll notice the difference. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you feel inspired to give these strategies a try and start thinking in English more often. Keep practicing, stay motivated, and don't forget that language learning is a journey. Until next time,